米国代表講演といたしまして、シカゴ大学プレシジョン医療研究センターセンター長教授で、世界のがん医療のトップランナーでいらっしゃるマーク・J・ラテイン様よりご講演いただきます。昨年までは VTR 映像でのご講演でしたが、今年は会場にお越しいただいての講演となります。テーマは米国が描くがん撲滅戦略2023です。同時通訳をいたしますので、皆様レシーバーをご利用ください。それではよろしくお願いいたします。
Thank you. So, this story begins on February 2nd, 2022, when President Biden, whose son died of cancer, his son Beau died of a brain tumor, and he wanted to refocus the goal of reducing cancer deaths and set the goal of reducing the death rate by at least 50% over the next 25 years by 2047. Now, this is not a goal of completely eliminating cancer, completely curing cancer, but it aims to reduce death from cancer, for example, by prevention, earlier detection, or better treatment. All of these would reduce the death rate from cancer. Now, much has been made of this goal of reducing cancer death rates, but when you read the headlines, there's a second part of this: improving the experience of living with and surviving cancer. Just as important, if not even more important. And reduce suffering from cancer, but reduce suffering from cancer treatment. Cancer treatment is often worse than cancer. Fear of cancer treatment is often greater than fear of cancer itself. Furthermore, there's a financial burden to cancer treatment. No matter where in the world you live, in some countries it may mean that you need to use all of your resources to pay for cancer treatment. In other countries, it may simply mean that your spouse needs to stop working to stay home and take care of you. So there's a financial burden of cancer treatment as well. Now, what's very interesting is that the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, the equivalent of the Japanese PMDA, has joined this battle to end cancer as we know it, and they focus on the concept of patient-centered regulatory decision-making as part of the mission of the FDA Oncology Center of Excellence. Patient-centered, not physician-centered, not drug company-centered. Now, this is a friend of mine in Chicago. Her name is Jill Feldman. She has lung cancer. She's had lung cancer for 18 years. She has a kind of lung cancer that's very common here in Japan, EGFR mutant lung cancer, affecting approximately 25% of patients with lung cancer here in Japan. And she's often told she looks great. In fact, I just saw her in Madrid. We were speaking in the same session. She does look great. But she doesn't feel great. She's got lots of side effects from treatment, chronic side effects, persistent side effects. And as she says, it's not the cancer that kills you. It's the side effects of the treatment that kill you. This is a cancer that is treated with oral drugs that are supposed to be targeted and gentle, yet they still have side effects, particularly if given in doses greater than what patients may actually need. You will often hear doctors say, oh, the side effects are manageable. Well, that's manageable for the doctor. And it doesn't, and the word tolerable means you can live with it, but it doesn't mean you're enjoying life. And so we need to change the thinking of treatment with cancer. Who would take medicines for cholesterol or blood pressure that made you feel sick constantly? Nobody would do it. So, as part of this FDA effort, they've developed Project Optimus. And Project Optimus is focused on ensuring that drugs that are approved in the United States are approved at doses that are no higher than what is necessary. Because if you administer a dose higher than what is necessary, you just get side effects without benefit. And unfortunately, there are many, many examples of drugs approved in countries around the world at doses that are significantly higher than are necessary. And I'll give you a couple examples in my remarks today. The US FDA also published a paper 2 years ago, The Drug Dosing Conundrum in Oncology, When Less is More. Giving less is better. Giving less gets you the same efficacy, less toxicity, better quality of life. Now, a lot of this was announced in May of 2021 in conjunction with the approval of another lung cancer drug. This is a different kind of lung cancer that has a specific mutation in KRAS, and it's the drug Lumakras, sotorasib, and it was the first drug treatment for this kind of lung cancer. And this is a lung cancer that affects between 10 and 15% of patients with lung cancer, both in the US and Japan. And the announcement by Amgen was that it was the first and only targeted treatment. But in the fine print, it said FDA is requiring a post-marketing trial to investigate whether a lower dose will have a similar clinical effect. A lower dose. Well, if you hear that, you might go, a little lower dose? A 75% lower dose, 1/4 of the dose that was approved. FDA said, we think you're 4 times overdosed. And so the drug was approved at a dose of 960 milligrams, with patients instructed to take 8 pills at a time every day, 120 milligram pills. And the FDA said, and you're going to have to study giving 2 pills compared to 8. And there were 5 reasons that were described by FDA. The first was pretty straightforward. If you give 4 or 5 times as much drug, you don't get any more in the blood. It goes down the toilet, unfortunately. It's not surprising that if you give a higher dose, you don't get any more benefit. And the same percentage of patients have shrinkage of their cancer. The FDA also said if you give less drug, you're going to have fewer gastrointestinal side effects. That's common sense. The company had also suggested before they did their trials that a much lower dose would be effective. At doses as low as 30 milligrams might work, yet they went all the way up to 960 milligrams. And again, another common sense point, it's difficult for patients to take 8 pills at a time. So patient-centered approach to this issue. And the FDA was right. The company has recently released the results of that study, and it showed that from the standpoint of benefit, 440 milligrams, 2 pills, is the same as 960 milligrams, 8 pills. The FDA was also right about the side effects. 960 milligrams had much greater side effects. So the higher dose causes more side effects, no greater benefit, And yet, that higher dose is still being sold around the world. And of course, 2 pills would only cost 1/4 as much as 8 pills. Maybe that's the reason the company doesn't want to suggest that physicians prescribe only 2 pills a day. Also, the company describes the side effects as well tolerated. Well, again, that's a relative term. It has side effects, and the side effects are unnecessary. Does that make it well tolerated, or does that just make it acceptable if that's your only alternative? Now, the math tells the whole story. So the company sells bottles of pills, a month's supply at a time, 240 pills in a bottle, so you can take 8 pills a day for 30 days. In the United States, it's about $100 a pill, $24,132 for a 1-month supply. And so if you go to 2 pills per day, they'd have to go to $400 per tablet if they wanted to keep their revenues the same, projected peak sales of $1 billion per year. And alternatively, they could lower the price of a bottle to $6,000, put 60 pills in the bottle, and keep the price per tablet the same at $101, and that would be $250 million a year. In other words, they either have to quadruple the price per pill or accept that the revenues are going to decrease by 75%, a very difficult challenge for a pharmaceutical company. The other issue is we now have a law in the United States that if they increase the price per tablet, they're going to have a financial penalty to the United States government in the forms of a rebate obligation under the Inflation Reduction Act. So another challenging issue for the manufacturer of this drug. Now, you have problems here in Japan. I heard Dr. Harris talk, and this is an article that was published in Nikkei Asia, Japan's Growing Debt Mountain, Crisis, What Crisis? And this looks like the wonderful view of Mount Fuji I had flying in yesterday. It was actually sunny, so you could see it. And, but there are financial issues here. And so perhaps there's an opportunity to reduce spending on drugs. So, and the problem is not just for those suffering from cancer. The problem is for everybody who's healthy, too. Because if the government has to pay more for drugs, you have to pay more in taxes to make that affordable, or something else is going to get cut. Or if your insurance is partially paid by an employer, you're going to get less of a salary increase every year, and salary increases are not keeping up with healthcare costs. I just found out that my healthcare premiums for next year as an employee at the University of Chicago are going up 8%. My salary certainly didn't go up 8%. So that's the problem. We're all paying for this tax on income in the form of healthcare costs. So as another example, there's an important drug, Opdivo, that was actually developed here in Japan by Ono, and it partnered with Bristol Myers Squibb. And this was the first immunotherapy, immune checkpoint inhibitor approved. It's approved for many kinds of cancers. It's highly effective. It's also highly overdosed. So the original dosing was to give 3 milligrams per kilogram every 2 weeks. Yet in India, they just finished showing that a much lower dose, just giving 20 milligrams every 3 weeks, okay, 6% basically of the cost of the standard dose, is effective. And this was done basically because the Indians had no choice. Nobody could afford the standard dose in India. And so they just simply said, well, we can't even study that standard dose. And it changed the affordability of this drug from less than 3% of patients who could afford it at the standard dose to more than 75% of patients in India who can now afford this drug, decreasing the cost of treatment from $744, which doesn't sound like a lot of money in the United States or Japan, completely unaffordable in India, down to $42 per dose. And that's affordable in India. There's also efforts ongoing here in Japan, and there's been a number of studies being done. There's one, for example, that was published from Shizuoka, their lung cancer group, looking at how long do you need to treat with immunotherapy for? Another important question. And they basically said there's no reason to keep going. After 2 years, for sure you should stop. And I will also tell you that may be too long, and we just looked at data that shows that they're giving too much. So you're giving too much for too long, driving up the costs. So in the United States, there's actually a little bit of effort to deal with this, and it's not so simple. Because while the FDA can require companies to do all of these studies, to get the dose right, to not give it too high, too long, whatever, before it's approved, they cannot require companies to do these studies after the drugs are approved. But in part of the appropriations that they received this year, they were told by Congress to start thinking about how to do this. And in their appropriations, there's a whole section on dosing optimization studies. And it basically says the committee, and this was written originally by a committee in our Senate called the Appropriations Committee. The committee is concerned about the escalating cost of specialty cancer drugs and biologics. And then it goes on to say the committee strongly encourages FDA to organize clinical trials. And then it says to assess whether dosing and frequency adjustments may decrease the cost of care and/or toxicities of treatment without compromising efficacy. We know these studies are possible. We know these studies could be done. In fact, many of us believe they should be done. The question is how to make it happen, and it's got to come from the public, influencing the government to require such studies, or working with other entities that actually fund the cost of cancer care. So in conclusion, for those cancers that can be effectively treated without chemotherapy, there needs to be greater attention to side effects and costs of treatment. Studies of lower doses of marketed drugs should be a high priority, ideally funded and organized by government agencies. A failure to address spending on cancer drugs will lead to progressive economic challenges for governments and employers around the world, including both Japan and the United States. Thank you for your attention. Arigato gozaimasu.
マーク・J・ラテン様、ありがとうございました。改めまして皆様、大きな拍手をお送りくださいませ。どうもありがとうございました。